Xinyan is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker based in Washington, D.C. Born and raised in Wuhan, China, Xinyan has covered major breaking news across Asia and North America for a decade and won several awards, including a WAN IFRA Asian Digital Media Award. Now an independent filmmaker, she has directed content for international broadcasters, including BBC, NHK, PBS, Nova, and PBS Frontline, and has been awarded numerous fellowships. So please welcome Xinyan Yu. You can't hear it, but you're getting applause now.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
lots of applause for you.
Thank you so
much. A fascinating film and very troublesome, obviously. But let's get to some of the basics of the filmmaking before we talk about some of the issues, if you don't mind. You filmed it over 4 years.
Yes.
How did you get started on this particular topic? What drew you to Ethiopia and to the issues there of development?
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for showing up for this film. It's not a topic that everyone is always interested in on a daily basis, but I'm really happy to bring this film to this community. I worked for BBC for many years, and I've always been really interested in China's influence in the developing world. Ethiopia was special to us because it was sort of considered the China of Africa, because it was very much similar to what China was doing in the 80s and the 90s, opening up the country for foreign investment and starting up these huge industrial zones across the coastal provinces. So Ethiopia actually made a very active plan to follow in China's footstep and actually invited a lot of factories to go to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a landlocked country, didn't really have a lot of resources, but what it did have is a huge young population. The average age of Ethiopia was under 18 years old. So they were facing a very big crisis, unemployment crisis. So China offered sort of a blueprint for where a country like Ethiopia could be heading. So interestingly, there were more than a dozen industrial zones across Ethiopia now, and we were really, really interested just to see whether this model could be replicated outside of China. I've lived through this period. My parents also worked in the factory. In a way, China has succeeded in lifting many people out of poverty. And so seeing that pattern unfold in another country and running into some of the similar problems that as journalists we have covered in China was really extremely fascinating. So in 2019, we took a field trip to Ethiopia and was really, really taken in with this industrial zone that had 30,000 workers.
So you had a co-director on this, Max Duncan. And did the two of you decide to take on this film together and say, let's go to Ethiopia and see what we can do with this industrial zone?
Yeah, so Max also worked in China for over 10 years for Reuters, and I was working for BBC, and we both were really interested in stories about development. He made a short film about migrant workers in China who moved from smaller cities into these coastal provinces working in these factories. So our career focused a lot on telling stories of people going through these very dramatic changes, especially in China. In 2019, we decided that journalism wasn't enough for our storytelling because all our stories were very short, were 15 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. So we decided to make a longer feature that we are able to tell the story from multiple perspectives and bring more nuances into a story that there was a lot of very black and white reporting out there. And so it's hard for people to really know what's going on there.
That's what all our audiences have found, and the lovers of documentary find, and that's what this film has done really well, is it puts a human face, makes personal what we see in the headlines and we see in news stories, but there it's just, this is the issue, this is the problem, this is the thing, but this is very personal. And to that end, how did you choose your main three protagonists?
Yeah, so the Eastern Industry Zone was sort of like a poster child of China's investment in Ethiopia. And every time when anybody, we shot so many delegations coming through, and every single time Moto was just very enthusiastic. When we went in 2018, it was her first year taking over, and so she had this drive and passion to be transparent, be interacting with the outside world. The Chinese community sometimes, we kept to ourselves. So it's really hard to really know what people are thinking and the sort of philosophy that, the Chinese investors and development strategies are. So Moto was someone who's very she spoke the Amharic, she spoke English. So when we met her, she had this very interestingly open-minded approach and said, okay, well, let's see how it goes. So over at the beginning, there you can see that she had a lot of drive and passion. She was very convinced that this is the model that could work for Ethiopia. But over time, we stayed there with the workers in the dormitory, and we stayed with her through a lot of meetings, and problems started to emerge, and you started to see these three women are on a crossroad, and the Ethiopian characters as well. The majority of the workers were women in this factory. Same in China, in the 80s and 90s. Women play a huge role in the workforce. And Wakinash was also someone who was really interesting in the village because she had five daughters who all worked in the factory, and she had this interesting divided opinion with her husband, which is very representative of what was going on in rural Ethiopia. People felt very conflicted about development, about economic expansion. On one hand, it did give them opportunities, but on the other, for especially men who felt very attached to their land, losing their land felt like they were losing their agency. Women tend to be more embracing to industrial development. And so Wakinash her family embodies this very common dilemma that rural families face. So we thought that these are the three perspectives that really paint a full pictures of how people are experiencing industrial development in Ethiopia.
And it was very well done. And it's just given them as avatars, as representatives for their different viewpoints. It's very interesting the way it played out. And I'd like to get to some of the issues again, but just back in terms of the filmmaking, that opening sequence of the marriage in the modern city marriage was sort of telling, because it's symbolic of this marriage between China and Ethiopia, and in this modern world, which is sort of a dream world, that down on the earth, the boots on the ground, it's a little bit different. But I thought that was very telling. So did you film them sort of all continuously and then sort out in editing to tell their different stories as they went through, or did you stay with one and then sort of stay with another? How did that work?
Actually, a lot of our footage was filmed at the beginning, around 2019, before COVID, actually, because there was so much going on. She was on this full year of activities, and so we were able to witness a lot of meetings, and the land argument was super interesting. The Chinese New Year celebration and land argument actually happened on the same day, so it was like a 15-hour shoot for us. So we got really lucky, and had great access. That marriage, for example, we actually shot two marriages. We had 500 hours of footage. Being journalists, we were just very curious about everything. And the marriage itself, marriage it is very symbolic of the relationship between China and Ethiopia. And sometimes in a marriage, you enjoy the convenience of the marriage, but you also sometimes want to run away from each other. So that process, yeah. So after 500 hours of footage, we found the story with our editor. Interestingly, our team is very, very international. We have Ethiopian producers. We have me and Max, and we also have a Danish editing team, and Spanish post-production house. So it's all through this process, it's really interesting because the story itself has a lot of quirks that maybe some of the people who have never been to China or Ethiopia might not understand. And working with the international team, our Danish editor and Spanish post-production house, they were able to bring in some international perspective to make sure that the story is more digestible. So they found the story with us, and sometimes we'll tell them ideas, about the local mayor, for example. Some of the stuff that he was doing is not so intuitive to audiences in the developed world. To me, someone who grew up in a developing country, seeing him, I understand that he's a corrupt official. But sometimes, when you show it to a Danish editor, he wouldn't immediately get it. So with his understanding, we added details here and there to help people understand the dynamics between the local government and the local officials and the local communities. That was really helpful. So the whole process, the story was found really through lots of work with the international team.
Well, I think it was brought up beautifully because each of them, even the small interactions, for instance, between the husband and the wife about the farming and should he rent some new land, and then the discussion with the daughter and the kidnapping of his mother in 8th grade. But what you spoke about before, about the difference between the way men feel about the land and their attachment to the land. And that's throughout Africa, and lots of different countries in Africa. The men are attached to farming and to their land, and the women were looking for other opportunities. I think that the social fallout is really significant, and it's brought to the fore articulately near the end of the film, but throughout the film. The lack of housing. I mean, it's always the focus is on 30,000 workers, 20,000 more workers. We can have 50,000 workers. There's never a mention of hospitals. There's never a mention of housing. There's never a mention of schools. It's just about the workers. And you brought that out, I think, in all the different exchanges until it was finally made articulate. What was I mean, when the letter came out from town government about hospitals, about promises that were made, and all she could focus on was, we can't develop. Why won't they let us develop? We have to develop. No answers to any of those questions. Did that ever come up as like, what about the social services? What about the other things? I mean, the town government building that park was as ridiculous as they said it was. But what about the lack of hospitals? What about, did the Chinese ever say, we're going to give you something like that? I mean, did that come up?
Yeah. We actually shot many meetings of them talking about building a school, and they almost built one, but they were bickering over the design of the school. It's really interesting because this is what Wakinesh, the farmer, was saying, that a lot of times the industrial development, the people, the fruit of their labor is not being protected by either the investor or the local government. The investors are in a rush to develop, and their theories that if you don't allow me to develop this land, where did I get the money to, or where do the contract cannot go ahead because it's contingent on us developing for phase 2. So they had this hotel. Actually, some of the facility were built, but they didn't finish it because the phase 2 wasn't continuing. And the local government was then also doing something that was completely not really benefiting the farmers. They were using the land to build the useless beautification project. And you can see that the workers having trouble with their buses every day. The roads are super narrow and always traffic jam going on. And there was really no initiative from the local government to expand infrastructure, nor was there any real effort from the Chinese investor side to build these facilities they promised without having the phase 2 land. So the farmers and workers were in limbo because the two powerful parties in this contract, social contract, weren't really delivering the promises that they gave at the beginning of this whole when the empire was built.
Right. And it would seem to me that phase 2 would have had a much better chance of going forward with those services if phase 1, the 30,000 workers in the first place, if there'd been housing for them, if there'd been schools for them, if there'd been hospitals for them, it would have been much easier to go with phase 2. But it seems like there was no consideration of that for the first 30,000 workers.
There was, so the companies were offering bus services in China. Actually, when they built the factory, they often had dormitories attached to the factory. And we actually asked the local workers in Ethiopia, workers don't like living in dormitories. Some of the companies did build dormitories, so we lived in these dormitories. They don't like being confined in a dormitory because they do have gates. The compound is locked. So that culturally does not work in Ethiopia, even though in China workers were very happy living in factory dorms. In fact, during COVID, the factory asked all the Ethiopian workers to live on their factory campus. People were really unhappy because the condition wasn't great. They have these bunker beds, and the condition wasn't very good for workers. So yeah, infrastructure was really not there. Even after phase one, there was not really anything to help the production to be scaled up. So the workers, that their living condition, they were renting mostly around the villages, around the factories, and the rent was going up really quickly. And the local government really also did not do much to help these workers with public housing. In some cases, we know that the workers are sharing beds as well. And Betty, for example, she used to share a place with another worker, but then she wanted some privacy for herself. So then she had this very, very small shoebox apartment. Yeah, and that's how they survived.
Yeah, well, so we don't have that much time, and I'd like to get some questions from the audience, but I did want to ask you, it seems that it's as fair and balanced as you could possibly be, but it seems like there's no really good guys necessarily here. There seem like there are some villains that are worse than other villains, but without taking sides, do you see a way past some of these intractable problems for the unemployment, for the social needs? I mean, because the social contract between human beings was falling apart too. There was just no support for any of that, and in terms of not only hospitals and schools, but just the social existence. So is there any way forward that can resolve some of these intractable problems that you see?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that people always want to have a hero and a villain, and this story does not have a full someone who's a complete hero or a villain. I think this is a necessary. I think I appreciate that. Before we made this film, if you read anything about China and Africa, there's very, very, very little diversity in really the voices from people, and you don't really see them humanized, the workers and the managers. You don't really see this on a human level. So the film itself, I think we want to keep it open-minded. And right now, when we show it at universities, it's a great case study for people to think, okay, what is the path to prosperity in 21st century? Does a developing country have to go through industrialization and sometimes very painful process to reach some sort of prosperity? China did, my generation compared to my parents' generation has improved a lot, but we also had a lot of environmental degradation and had a whole generation of people who had to work long hours in factories, people who are like my parents. But in a way, the system, whether that system works or not, we want to keep it open so we understand the challenge that some of these developing countries face and the limited options that they have. So going forward, I think part of the impact campaign that we want to do with this film is showing it to people who are in policymakers, who can come up with policy frameworks. For example, fair wages, protecting fair wages, and educating people on land rights. A lot of the problems that came up in this is because there was a shortage of people understanding how land rights work. Local governments sold the land for much less than they should have. So there's a lack of education in terms of Ethiopia doesn't even have a minimum wage for the private sector. Talks have been going on, but they haven't set a minimum wage for the private sector yet. So part of what we want to do is to show this film to various communities, including workers and farmers in various developing countries and in developed countries as well, for countries to discuss policy frameworks that can help countries understand that they need to protect the fruit of the labor of these people who are struggling on a daily basis while contributing to the development of their nation. So you're just serving a larger cause, but often at the expense of um, your own individual futures. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Do we have any? Yes, just wait for a microphone because she can't hear you unless you're speaking to the microphone.
Thank you for your film. Excellent film. Thank you. I'm glad you talked about your impact project, because that was what was in my mind. There are moral issues, and I wondered whether business schools, it's hard to get a feature-length film into the academic world, but what your plans are to get, or World Bank kind of organizations. And lastly, is there print material that goes with it, discussion guide, previewing, post-viewing, bibliography, etc.? That's it.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're doing our thinking for us. This is my first time doing the impact campaign. Yes, we're hoping to develop a education guide. We just had 1 week of theatrical run in London, and there are many universities studying development, China-Africa relations in UK, for example, that reach out to us, that want to do screenings with us. Business schools as well. Embassies in Addis Ababa have reached out to us. We're having 1 week of screening in Kenya that also had a lot of Chinese investment. So yes, a lot of screenings are happening, and we are hiring an impact producer who's Kenyan, basically based out of East Africa, hoping that we can organize community screenings in East Africa. Yeah, so educational guide as well. And making really fair wages and land rights central to our impact campaign. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we just have time for one more question.
Okay.
Please, right over there.
I know you're just the director of this film, but I want to ask Andrew's question again. How can you expect to have 20,000 workers uprooted from wherever they live to come to a place with no infrastructure, not land rights, not roads, hospitals, schools, other things, and you really haven't answered that. Maybe there was no attempt, but I really want to pose that question again.
Thank you. It's not that easy. I grew up in a developing country. I know how hard it is, and this story is about capitalism and globalization, and sometimes these are forces that don't really think in a long-term effect. And when I grew up in China, when I was a journalist in China, I covered so many problems with land arguments, land disputes, and workers protesting. In Ethiopia, these problems are happening again, and without a very strong local government and strong policy framework, investors are not doing what they should do to put this infrastructure in place, and it's a joint responsibility as well. In Dukum, this small town, there are dormitories but they're run not by the company or by the local government, so people are struggling. It's easy to ask the question, but in reality, it's difficult for it to happen in such a perfect condition. So unfortunately, a lot of factories are built without enough infrastructure to build them. So part of what we want to do is to raise that awareness and for people to understand the personal struggles some of these families are going through. And I wanted to say that, migrant workers are not uncommon. When I was growing up, it's very common for workers to go where the factories are. And that's just how the harsh reality. And a lot of people accepted it because that was the only jobs that were available. So you either choose to be hungry or you choose to work in a factory. It's the harsh reality that some of us have to live through. And so what's problematic right now is that we are in the 21st century already. You know, China went through this 30 years ago, and now there are still countries that are living under the poverty line. So I think as nations, people need to think about better ways to develop and lift people out of poverties without repeating the same problems that China went through 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think that that's obviously the focus, or needs to be the focus of this impact statement and policymakers going forward, as to how to do this in humanitarian ways and ways that will uphold the social contracts that we have. But you've pointed the way to us very clearly, and you've made a wonderful film that does put the human face on it and makes it personal. So thank you very much for the film, and thank you for giving us your time today. And that's more applause for you, by the way. There's more applause going for you now. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming.